Here we are on the Studio Q landing page, and as you can see, we have a link to deployment guide, and then we get an overview of the reference architecture as well as the stuff that is built by it bulleted. I'm going to jump right into the deployment guide. Deployment guide gives you some more overview stuff, costs, licenses, the normal things. Let's talk a bit about the architecture. So Studio Q has two options. It can deploy the entire VPC and all the infrastructure inside of it, or it can deploy just the infrastructure in an existing VPC. Today, we'll deploy the entire VPC. So in the private subnet, so when I say VPC, that means the entire VPC, subnets, public, private, internet gateways, NAT gateway. In the private subnet, you see the Qumulo instances. These are M5 2x larges today, along with the EBS volumes that underpin those. A Active Directory domain controller is also spun up, and all the workstations and cluster are connected to it. That provisioner instance does secondary provisioning of the Qumulo, and then we have a metrics collector that's monitoring metrics on the Qumulo, sending those to CloudWatch. The health monitor monitors the EBS volumes, checks to see if there's any failures, and replaces those, sends a notification to SNS. And then up in the public subnet, we have the workstations. By default, 1 up to 10 in the first pass, as we mentioned. And those all get an elastic IP, public static IP, so it's easy for people to get back to their workstation. So let's just scroll down here. I've already reviewed my quotas. I've got everything I need. I'm going to deploy in US West 2, Oregon. That's all the supported regions for the quick start. I've already accepted my license, but if you hadn't, there's directions here on how to do so from Marketplace. And then I'm going to click right into Deploy Studio Q in a new VPC. Okay, it automatically pops up, populates the URL. I'm going to select my region from the top right corner, Oregon, click Next. I'm going to give this a little bit more intuitive name something a bit more post-production oriented. I'll call it Post Team 1. And then got to pick an AZ. I'll go for US West 2B. Subnets look good by default, but I want to go with the 12 terabyte hybrid. I'm going to keep the default of M5 2x larges. I am sensitive to who uses my data from an encryption perspective, so I'm going to deploy my own encryption key. You see me paste that in from KMS. Leave the cluster name. The security group needs to match the VPC of the subnet, and you can see that by default those do match. I'll keep that share name Adobe Projects. Skip the recovery topic because I haven't set up SNS notifications. And now I'm going to enter the password for my sidecar. Sidecar is deploying those Lambdas. We'll talk more about that in a moment. I'm going to pick G4DN 4X larges, and I'm going to do 4 of those. I bumped my instance size up in case I want to do a bit more After Effects work. You can choose to enhance your security group for all these instances with the source IP that your public connection is coming from, but I'm going to just leave that wide open for now. Next, set up the domain controller. This primarily is just entering a bunch of passwords, so we need a Active Directory service admin password. And by the way, all these passwords are stored in Secrets Manager. So if you fat finger one or just forget what you put in, you can always go just grab them from Secrets Manager. Need a safe mode password. And none of these are auto-populated. You can see none of them echo back. They are all quite securely treated per AWS policy. This is the important one, the Active Directory default account password. So you pick that, and that is what your users will use in their first login. I'm going to keep the domain name of studioq.local. I'm going to keep the A record name of Qumulo. It gives me a UNC path of qumulo.studioq.local. I don't need to change anything about the bucket. That was all populated by the quick start. And so let's just review our stack and click Next. I think I entered everything right, so I'm going to click both these acknowledgements and create stack. Okay, so now the stack is building, and you can see that the first thing it does is go create the VPC. Okay, we've fast forwarded in time, the stack is built. Let's take a look at what it built and tell you a bit more about that. You can see that VPC stack and then a Studio Q stack. Those are two nested stacks under the top level YAML file. Let's push into the Studio Q stack because it's got a bunch of nested stacks underneath it. The first one is the secret stack. This is storing all those passwords that we typed in the template. Pretty helpful if you need to refer to it. Then the security stack's creating some security groups for subsequent use by the infrastructure. And then next is the IAM stack. IAM stack is creating an IAM profile for the cluster so that it can manage EC2 secondary IPs as floating IPs in Qumulo language for IP failover. Next is the Q stack. That's the Qumulo stack for all of the instances in the cluster, plus the underpinning EBS volumes, placement group creation, EBS volume tagging, a bunch of stuff goes on in the Q stack. And then next is the DC stack. I think my mouse is going to move there momentarily. That's the domain controller. So that's spinning up the Active Directory server, as well as DNS for the VPC. And then next after that is the sidecar stack. That's spinning up those two Lambda functions we mentioned in the reference architecture for metrics and disk recovery. And then the provisioning stack. This is a small instance that is spun up that does the secondary provisioning of the Qumulo cluster. So that's pounding in sidecar username, password, as well as custom RBAC role, EBS volume tagging, all of that secondary stuff that needs to be done on the cluster. And then the CloudWatch stack. This is creating two resource groups so that users can get quick, easy, filtered views of their cluster EC2 infrastructure and EBS volumes in CloudWatch. Finally, we hit the workstation stack. Was what we really, all came here for. So the first workstation is turned up, and then the subsequent workstations are turned up in parallel. So you can see those last three are kicked off in parallel. So whether you do one workstation, well, I should say whether you do 2 or 10, it's about the same time to turn up the stack. So let's just go ahead and take a look at our EC2 infrastructure quickly, just to make sure that we've got what we expect. There's our domain controller, an M5 large. The provisioning node, which was spun up, did its job and automatically shuts down. That's all in the directions to monitor. There's your 4 nodes for the cluster, and then the 4 workstations below that, G4DN 4X larges. Let's pop back here to the top level stack from CloudWatch and look at the outputs. You can see that we have a bunch of links here. So if you need to get to the knowledge base, if you want to know the private IP address, you're trying to access the cluster from a machine in your VPC, there's the temporary password for the cluster. If you haven't installed the PCOIP client on your machine, there's a link there that'll let you do that. I'm going to jump right into that first workstation we spun up. Kick off the PCOIP client, which I've already installed. Click New Connection, drop the IP address in, hit Next. Self-signed URL. Okay, so here is the username and the password that I entered. All right from the template. Authentication with PCOIP. This session ironically took longer to authenticate than normal. So here we are at the landing screen, if you will, on a workstation. Automatically pop up the sign in to Adobe. You see the link in the top left. That's a link to the share, and then there's a link to the Qumulo UI. A bunch of other links there as well. I'm just going to go ahead and download Creative Cloud and install it. And while that's taking place, I'm going to take a look at the cluster and just verify I pasted in that password that you saw in the CloudFormation outputs. You can see we got 12.6 terabyte usable. And if we click more details, there's the 4 instances that we spun up. If we click into one of those, we'll see our EBS volumes, a mix of SSD because this is a hybrid cluster, and the spinning disk behind that is ST1 volumes, 10 by 500 gigabyte. Look at the network configuration. You see a persistent IP per node plus 3 floating IPs. That's all been set up. And here are our local users and groups. There's a sidecar user that was created, as well as a Studio Q local user just for convenience. Role management, there's our sidecar user, custom RBAC role. And then let's just make sure it's joined to the Active Directory domain. Indeed it is. Joined to the Studio Q domain. Okay, we do have a little bit of content on here because I placed content on this cluster. If we go look at our Capacity Explorer, we can see it's all sitting in that Adobe Projects SMB share. If we click into that, you can see it's dominated by media for a Adobe project that I've placed on this cluster. Those that are familiar with Qumulo, probably somewhat familiar with Capacity Explorer, you can hover on these things, get information about all the files, types, sizes. So we'll jump back to we'll basically shrink this screen over to the left and just blow up the section of the dashboard that shows our read, write, throughput, and latency. And we'll kick off Adobe Premiere Pro. This will show you a little bit of activity on the cluster. It's not going to push the cluster, but gives you a sense for the function. Notice the cache files are all being cached on the Qumulo. I've disabled local caching on the workstation. Not a recommended Adobe practice, but makes the demo better. So here's a video that Adobe put together for Qumulo. You can see it's got a quite complicated audio track with a bunch of effects, a bunch of cuts on the video. So it's a decent timeline for this little minute 10 video. Let's just roll this.
Dreamers, the make-believers that pull the ethers from the clouds. We're dreamers, stargazers, and the sky blinks back. 1 billion eyes on a call to act. Show them. Create a path with a kick drum, leave a footprint with a djembe, dare and do your worst and your magic, chase the clouds, snatch the invisible, make believe, dreamer. Because we are here to live our breath, we are here to leave our breath, our souls and our stories, to live our moment, to live our legend, to be told. Leave your footprint among the stars for the rest of us to follow.
Okay, so that's some HD content, all long GOP MP4 stuff. Doesn't push cluster hard. You can see that if I scrub the timeline, I'm getting more up in that 27 megabytes, still not pushing the cluster hard, but bumped it up from the 14 peak you saw before. Let's roll it at 2x and 4x. 2, 4. So you can see there that that got us up around 34 meg, I believe it was. And again, if you're watching the video, because that's more interesting than the graphs on the left, you might have missed that, but you can see it here. If you look over to the left, you'll see the throughput up there around 34. So again, not pushing the cluster hard, but gives you an idea of the fact that the environment is all up and running, workstation fully functional with Premiere Pro. So that's a wrap on the demo.